Last weekend, my son and I sat down to watch one of the football games. And at the very beginning, we heard, those words that I'm guessing many of us hear at the beginning of a sporting event, and sometimes other times. It's not the national anthem. It's Michael Buffer introducing the athletes to prepare themselves. See if I can do this. Let's get ready to rumble! He actually trademarked that. And now I've done my legal responsibility to mention that. On a more serious note, that's really the theme of all three readings today. Let's get ready. I guess a little bit to rumble. Let's get ready to make room in our lives for God. And it's hard. You have to fight at it once in a while to make that room with all the noise, distraction, the needs and the wants that we have, to make room to make God a priority in our lives. That call is usually an awakening, preparing the athletes, football game or a boxing match usually. It's time. The time is now at hand. Get ready to respond. Get ready to respond to what you've been training for, what you've been listening to, the instructions that you've been given. In the gospel, Jesus introduces Peter and his fishing partners to what they are going to be called to do. They're confused and stunned initially at that miraculous catching of so many fish. And he tells them, do not be afraid. Words that we hear throughout the Bible, do not be afraid. And now you'll be catching men. You'll be doing much what I've been doing in my preaching so far. St. Paul then gives his account of his call to ministry, reminding all the people that there were many, many people that had witnessed Christ's resurrection so that they can know the reality of what really happened. And Paul, although he persecuted the church and felt unfit to be preaching God's word, he's been now called to share the gospel. By the grace of God, I am what I am. And we heard that very unique call of Isaiah, like Peter and Paul, feeling unworthy. Woe is me, I am doomed, he tells the angels. But he steps forward emphatically, here I am, Lord, send me to do your will. Today's readings are about getting ready to respond to God's call. And it's not just for Isaiah, Paul, and Peter, it's for us too. Making rooms in our lives. And it's a continuation of the readings that we've heard over the past few weeks, where Jesus has been revealing himself, talking about the gifts that we're each given that are meant to be shared with one another so we come together in unity. He's come because of God's love for us, to remind us that we're each beloved and each given those gifts for the benefit of one another, for building up God's kingdom. That building of God's kingdom, it's our invitation to holiness, to help God in his mission of bringing everyone together. God's love in each of our hearts and opening that love, sharing it in our lives. It's time for each of us to get ready. Peter, Paul, and Isaiah remind and encourage us because they each had a very unique call themselves. We each have a unique journey, much like the saints. Many of the saints didn't feel worthy, didn't know where they were going, but then found a way to listen, to find that call from God. Mother Teresa, small in stature, but what a commanding personality. She attracted so many to her mission to help the poor. St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, she was a convert. She was a Protestant, but she heard the call. She converted, and then she was abandoned by her friends and family. Invited by a local bishop to start a school, she accepted, and she'd go on to start hundreds of schools in the United States and become the first native-born saint in the United States. St. Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, young, wanting to be so much to join the same religious order as her sisters, turned down because she was too young. As she was visiting Rome with her father, she pleaded with the Pope. She went right to the Pope. He told her, if it's God's will, you will enter. And upon returning home, the bishop had changed his mind and invited her to join. And in her short life, she'd go on to write a journal, and a wonderful, wonderful journal explaining the presence of Jesus in her life and how we can find God's call to us. And our own St. Joseph, depicted in the stained glass windows, a carpenter who he's thrown into something he never would have imagined to become the stepfather of the Messiah, responsible for teaching and mentoring Jesus. Each of them different in their own way, different circumstances, but called to holiness, much like us. Be not afraid. Be ready. Be ready to listen. You never know under what circumstances God's call will be there for us. How do we know? How and when is God's call going to come? It's different for each of us. No one can definitively really tell you. But we do know to find it, we've got to spend some time. We've got to make room for God in our life. Some time talking to Him and listening to where He may be guiding us. Having that relationship. How did I know? A call to the diaconate. It was a combination of things. I had to take some time off for work. Circumstances allowed me to take that time off, and it led to me to just think through and sort some things out. Spoke to my wife, spoke to my dad, spoke to some others, and it became pretty obvious. What's each of our calls? Are we ready for it? Are we listening? Are we called to leave everything, like we hear in the readings today? In a way, yes. We leave some room for God in our lives. Make time to have that relationship with Him. We're each loved by God and part of His plan to build the kingdom in Ronkonkoma, the kingdom in heaven. But are we ready? Are we listening? And are we ready to respond? Those are things we need to consider.